The restaurant glowed that evening, warm lights bouncing off crystal glasses, laughter floating through the air, and the aroma of grilled steak mingling with soft jazz music. It was one of those high-end places where people didn't just eat, they performed luxury. At the far end of the room, unnoticed at first, stood an old woman. Her clothes were faded, her scarf frayed at the ends, and her shoes looked tired from too many miles. Yet her eyes held a quiet dignity, the kind that had seen too much of life to be easily broken. She waited near the counter, clutching her small handbag like a fragile secret. The waiters moved around her, busy, efficient, pretending not to notice. When she finally gathered the courage, she approached the cashier and said softly, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind if I took some of the leftover food? Anything you were going to throw away?" The young man behind the counter blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. His hesitation was enough for the nearby diners to glance over. A group of young people sitting near the bar snickered. One of them, a woman in a red dress with glittering earrings, laughed aloud. Did she just ask for leftovers? Oh, how pathetic. The words sliced through the air like cold steel. The old woman's hands trembled, but she didn't speak. Another waiter, trying to impress the crowd, added mockingly, "Ma'am, this isn't a charity kitchen. Maybe try the street vendors outside." Laughter erupted. Phones came out. Someone whispered, "Let's record this. People need to see how far some folks will go for food." The old woman's eyes dropped to the floor, her lips trembling as she murmured, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bother anyone." She turned to leave, but just then a deep, calm voice cut through the noise. "Wait." The laughter stopped. Everyone turned toward a man sitting alone in the corner booth, tall, dressed simply in a gray shirt and black jacket. He looked ordinary, yet something in his presence commanded silence. The waiter stuttered, "Sir, is everything okay?" The man stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on the old woman. "How much is your most expensive meal?" he asked. The cashier, confused, answered, The grand platter, sir. It's $150. Good," the man said, pulling out his wallet. "Pack 2 of those, one for her and one for me. We'll eat together." Gasps spread across the restaurant. The woman in red scoffed. "You can't be serious. You'll actually eat with her?" He turned to her, his tone icy but calm. "You think dignity depends on the clothes someone wears? On the table they sit at?" He gestured to the old woman. "That woman asked for food, not your opinion." The room fell silent. The old woman's eyes widened, confusion and disbelief mixing with tears. "Please, sir," she whispered, "you don't have to." "I insist," he said. The manager, now visibly nervous, rushed to arrange a table. Moments later, the man and the old woman were seated together in the same elegant dining area that had mocked her moments before. Plates of steaming food arrived. Golden steak, buttery potatoes, fresh bread. The old woman stared at the plate as if it were a dream. Her hand shook slightly as she picked up the fork. "I haven't eaten like this in years," she said quietly. The man smiled faintly. "Then let tonight be special." As they ate, the curious eyes around them softened. The same diners who had laughed now whispered uneasily among themselves. The woman in red shifted in her seat, suddenly uncomfortable in her glittering perfection. When the meal ended, the old woman looked up at her mysterious companion. "Thank you, kind sir. You've done more than feed me. You reminded me that kindness still exists." He smiled gently. "I didn't do it for kindness," he said, pulling something from his pocket, a small worn locket. He placed it on the table, and the old woman froze. Her eyes widened as she reached out, trembling. That's my husband's locket. He lost it 30 years ago." The man's voice softened, almost breaking. "I know, because he was my father." The old woman's hand flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. The man continued, "You're my grandmother. You disappeared after Grandpa died. We searched for you everywhere. The entire restaurant seemed to disappear. The noise, the people, the lights, leaving only the 2 of them, bound by blood and fate, reunited in the most unexpected way." The old woman whispered, voice shaking, "You're Daniel." He nodded slowly. "Yes, Grandma. I finally found you." Her tears fell freely now. "All these years, I thought you'd all forgotten me." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. "Never. You were lost, but you were never forgotten." But just as warmth began to fill the old woman's chest, a man in a black suit appeared near the entrance, speaking urgently into a phone. Daniel's expression changed, from calm to tense, from gentle to alert. The old woman noticed. "What's wrong, my child?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated, eyes scanning the room. "Nothing, Grandma. Just someone I didn't expect to see." The man in black turned toward their table, and the moment his gaze met Daniel's, the old woman's newfound peace began to tremble again. Daniel's grip on the old woman's hand tightened just slightly. His calm expression was now shadowed by unease, his eyes flickering toward the man in black, who had stopped near the restaurant entrance. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the kind of presence that silenced conversation. He wasn't dressed like a customer. He was dressed like someone who watched people for a living. The old woman followed Daniel's gaze, her frail fingers curling instinctively. "Do you know him, Daniel?" she whispered. Daniel forced a thin smile. "I hoped I wouldn't have to see him again." Before she could ask more, the man in black began walking toward their table. His steps were deliberate, each one echoing in the now quiet restaurant. The waiters, sensing tension, froze mid-step. Even the laughter that had filled the air earlier had evaporated into a heavy silence. When the man finally reached them, he stopped just a few feet away and said in a deep voice, "Daniel Harris, you're a hard man to find." The old woman's eyes darted between the two men. "Daniel, what's happening?" Daniel stood, pushing his chair back slowly. "I could ask you the same question," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "Why are you here, Mr. Collins?" The man, Collins, smirked faintly. "You disappeared in the middle of an ongoing investigation. My bosses don't like loose ends." The old woman blinked, confused. "Investigation? Daniel, you work for the police?" Collins let out a short, humorless laugh. "Police? Not exactly. Your grandson works for people who fund the police. Private operations. Intelligence. Dangerous work for dangerous men." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's enough." But Collins ignored him and turned to the old woman, his tone smooth but cold. "Did he tell you who he really is, ma'am? Or why someone like him would suddenly show up here, pretending to be a good Samaritan?" The old woman's lips parted slightly, confusion and fear swirling in her eyes. "Daniel, what is he talking about?" Daniel didn't look at her. His voice was steady, but his hands were tense. "Grandma, please. Don't listen to him. Not here." Collins crossed his arms. "She deserves the truth. Tell her about the file, Daniel. Tell her about the billions that went missing. Tell her who you really work for." A murmur rippled through the restaurant again. Phones were raised once more, this time not for mockery, but out of curiosity, fear, fascination. Daniel's eyes flashed with warning. "You're making a scene." "That's the point," Collins said coolly. "You've been hiding in plain sight. But I'll admit, I didn't expect you to be feeding old women tonight." At that, Daniel's voice dropped low. "Watch your words." The old woman's voice trembled. "Daniel, please, what is going on? Who are these people?" Daniel knelt beside her chair, lowering his tone. "Grandma, I promise I'll explain everything. Just trust me for now." But Collins stepped closer. "You really think she'd trust you if she knew what you've done? If she knew that the same organization you worked for?" "Enough!" Daniel snapped, his voice echoing across the restaurant. For a brief second, the calm, gentle man who had defended his grandmother vanished. In his place stood someone harder, someone trained, dangerous, and used to being obeyed. Even Collins hesitated. Then Daniel straightened, his tone cold again. "You're not taking me anywhere. Not tonight." Collins smirked. "You think you have a choice?" Before either could move, the restaurant door burst open. Two men in dark coats entered, their movements sharp and synchronized. They weren't waiters. The diners began to panic, whispers turning into gasps. The waiters backed away toward the kitchen. Daniel turned instantly, his body tense. "Grandma, he said under his breath. When I say go, you move toward the back exit. Don't stop for anything. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. Daniel, I don't understand. You don't need to, he said softly. Just trust me. The two men flanked Collins, one whispering something into his ear. Collins nodded slightly, then looked at Daniel. Orders changed. We're not here to arrest you anymore. We're here to protect you. Daniel froze. Protect me? Collins's tone grew grim. They found her too. The old woman blinked. Found who? Daniel's stomach sank. No, that's not possible. Collins stepped closer, his expression finally showing a trace of concern. You think you were the only one looking for her? The people you double-crossed, they know who she is now. They're on their way. Daniel's pulse quickened. How long do we have? Maybe 10 minutes, if we're lucky, Collins said. The old woman clutched her scarf. Daniel, who's coming? What are they talking about? Daniel turned to her, his voice heavy with urgency. Grandma, I'll explain later. But right now we have to leave. He reached out his hand. She hesitated only for a second before taking it. Together, they began moving toward the back of the restaurant. Collins gestured to his men. Clear the way. But just as they reached the kitchen door, a deafening crash echoed from the front. The glass shattered inward as a black SUV rammed into the entrance. Screams filled the air. People ducked under tables. Daniel spun around. 3 masked men stepped out of the vehicle, armed and moving fast. They weren't amateurs. They were trained ruthless. Collins shouted, Down! As bullets tore through the air, shattering bottles and glass. Daniel pulled his grandmother to the ground, shielding her with his body. The sound of chaos consumed the restaurant. Metal clattering, people crying, alarms blaring. The smell of smoke and gunpowder filled the air. Daniel grabbed a fallen chair and used it to block the view from the shooters. Stay here, he whispered to his grandmother. Don't move until I come back. She held on to his sleeve. Daniel, please, don't go. But it already moved, sliding behind an overturned table, eyes scanning the attackers. Collins and his men had taken cover behind the bar, returning fire. Daniel shouted, Collins, they're not here for me. They're here for her. Collins shouted back, Then get her out now. Daniel crawled toward the kitchen door, bullets whizzing inches above his head. He reached his grandmother again and pulled her up. Come on. Together, they slipped through the swinging doors into the chaos of the kitchen. Pots clanged, steam hissed, and terrified cooks scrambled for shelter. Daniel led her through the narrow hallway toward the back exit. Just as they neared the door, one of the masked men burst in from the side entrance. His eyes locked on the old woman. There! He shouted. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed a metal tray from a counter and flung it hard. It slammed into the man's arm, sending his gun skidding across the floor. Daniel tackled him, the two crashing into a rack of plates. Run, Grandma! Daniel yelled, but she froze, tears streaming down her face. I can't leave you. Go, he roared. Collins burst into the kitchen, firing a shot that sent the masked man sprawling. Move, both of you. Daniel grabbed his grandmother's hand again, pulling her toward the exit. The alley outside was dark, wet from the evening rain. A single streetlight flickered above. Keep moving, Daniel said, glancing behind them. There's a car around the corner. But before they could reach it, another figure stepped out from the shadows. Tall, wearing a long coat, and holding something in his hand. The old woman gasped. Daniel, that face... I've seen him before. Daniel's heart stopped. Where? Her voice quivered. He used to come to our house. When your father was still alive. He said he was an old friend. The man in the coat smiled faintly, his voice smooth as silk. Ah, so you do remember me, Mrs. Harris. Good. It saves me the trouble of introductions. Daniel stepped in front of her. You're the one who started all this. The money, the lies, everything leads back to you. The man tilted his head. You were never supposed to find her, Daniel. That was the deal. You walk away. She stays forgotten. But now, he sighed, now I have no choice. He raised his hand, and what glinted in it was not a gun, but something far older, a small silver pendant. The old woman's breath caught. That belongs to your grandfather. How do you have that? Daniel's voice was cold, because he was the one who betrayed him. The man's smile didn't waver. I didn't betray your grandfather, boy. I saved him, and I've been waiting 30 years for you to come looking for the truth. Rain began to pour harder, thunder rumbling in the distance as Daniel stared at the man who held his family's secret in his palm, realizing that everything he thought he knew about his past was about to change forever. The rain poured harder now, turning the alley into a mirror of glistening puddles that reflected the tremble of the streetlight above. Daniel stood between the old woman and the man in the long coat, the same man who had haunted the shadows of his family's past. The silver pendant in the man's hand seemed to glow faintly under the dim light, the way memories sometimes do before they destroy you. The old woman's frail voice trembled. I remember that pendant. Your grandfather never took it off. He said it held something important, something that could change everything. The man smiled, his eyes calm yet unreadable. He was right. It did change everything, and it will again tonight. Daniel's heart pounded. You're lying. My grandfather was a good man. You used him. The man stepped forward, his shoes splashing in the shallow rainwater. Your grandfather and I built an empire together before greed poisoned it. When he realized what our work was truly funding, he tried to walk away, so I made sure he couldn't. The old woman gasped, clutching her chest. You killed him? The man didn't flinch. Killed? No, he destroyed himself. But I took what he couldn't protect, his legacy. Daniel's fist tightened. That legacy doesn't belong to you, doesn't it? The man said softly. Everything you have, your education, your career, the power you've tasted, all came from what he left behind. You've been walking my path since the day you were born. Daniel's eyes darkened. Then tonight, I step off it. In a blur. He lunged forward, knocking the pendant from the man's hand. It clattered onto the wet ground, spinning before stopping at the old woman's feet. She bent slowly and picked it up, her fingers trembling as she opened the small latch. Inside was not a photo, not a relic, but a thin piece of paper folded many times over, protected by decades of secrecy. She unfolded it with care, revealing handwriting that time had not managed to erase. Her eyes widened, her lips quivering as she whispered, It's your grandfather's confession. The man's face twisted. Don't read that aloud. But she did. Her voice cracked, soft but powerful against the storm. Asterisk if this letter is ever found. It means I failed. The fortune we built was stained by the blood of innocence, a secret buried beneath false charities and corporate names. To whoever finds this, destroy it, before it destroys you. Asterisk. The air went still. Even the rain seemed to hesitate. Daniel stared at her, realization dawning. He knew. The man's expression hardened. And he was weak. That letter could ruin everything. Decades of work, power, control. Hand it over. The old woman held the pendant to her chest. You took my husband's life. You will not take his truth. The man's patience snapped. He drew a gun from inside his coat, his voice rising over the thunder. I said, give it to me. Daniel moved instantly, stepping in front of his grandmother. You'll have to go through me first. Collins and his men burst into the alley. Just then, weapons drawn. Drop it. Collins barked. Drop the gun now. But the man only smiled, his eyes gleaming. You think you can stop me, Collins? You've been feeding off my payroll for years. I know every man in your operation. Collins froze. The accusation hit like lightning. Daniel glanced at him sharply. Tell me he's lying. Collins hesitated, just a breath too long. The truth was written in his silence. Daniel's world tilted. You knew? Collins's jaw clenched. I tried to protect you, Daniel, but you were in too deep. I couldn't. Enough? The man interrupted, his voice cutting like glass. This ends now. Hand me the letter or she dies. He pointed the gun directly at the old woman's heart. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. Don't do this. The man's tone turned almost gentle. You think this is about killing her? No. This is about erasing the last witness to what your grandfather did, what you helped rebuild. Daniel's anger surged, but beneath it was sorrow, a weight years in the making. You talk about empires, about power, but all I see is a man afraid of the truth. The man sneered. Truth doesn't feed nations, Daniel. Lies do. Controlled lies. And then everything happened at once. The old woman, trembling but fierce, took a step forward, and in one swift motion, threw the pendant into a puddle at Daniel's feet. The truth belongs to those who can bear it, she said. The man fired. Daniel lunged. The gunshot echoed across the alley, muffled by the storm. For a heartbeat, time stopped. The old woman collapsed into Daniel's arms, her breath shallow, her eyes fluttering. "Grandma! No, no!" "Stay with me," Daniel cried, his voice breaking. Rain mixed with the blood, seeping through her shawl. She smiled weakly, her fingers brushing his cheek. "You found me, my child. That's all that matters." Tears streamed down his face. "I'm not losing you again." Her hand trembled, reaching toward the pendant on the ground. "Promise me, protect the truth. Don't become like them." "I promise," he whispered, clutching her hand. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Then I can rest." Her eyes closed. The life that had endured years of pain and hunger finally slipped into peace. Something in Daniel shattered. He turned slowly toward the man, eyes burning, not with rage, but with something colder. "You killed her." The man lowered his gun, his expression unreadable. "Collateral damage." Daniel stood, rain pouring down his face, his grandmother's blood on his hands. Collins raised his weapon again, shouting, "Daniel, don't." But Daniel didn't listen. He moved forward, each step echoing through the storm. The man aimed his gun again, but Daniel was faster. He tackled him, the gun skidding across the ground. The two men struggled, fists and fury colliding. The pendant rolled between them, glowing under the streetlight like the last piece of truth the world hadn't yet destroyed. The man reached for it, but Daniel slammed his hand down over it. "You've taken everything from me," Daniel growled. The man gasped. "And you'll take nothing back." Daniel's punch silenced him. The man fell still, unconscious. Collins approached cautiously. "Daniel, it's over." Daniel stood slowly, breathing hard. "No, it's not." He looked at the pendant, then at his grandmother's still body. She wanted the truth protected. "That's what I'll do." He knelt beside her, taking the letter and sliding it into his jacket pocket. Then, for the first time that night, he looked up at the sky, the rain washing away blood, guilt, and years of buried secrets. "I'll make sure they all pay," he whispered. Weeks passed. The restaurant reopened, but whispers still lingered about the night. It turned into a war zone. Collins vanished from the public eye, and Daniel Harris, the man who once hid behind silence, became a ghost story whispered in corridors of power. Until one morning, an encrypted file appeared in the inboxes of major news networks, humanitarian organizations, and international courts. Inside it was a confession letter, scanned in full, along with hundreds of classified documents exposing decades of corruption, laundering, and human exploitation tied to some of the world's most powerful names. At the bottom of the file was a single message: "Truth belongs to those who can bear it. DH. The world erupted. Governments fell. Charities collapsed. Billionaires vanished. And in a quiet graveyard on the outskirts of the city, a man knelt beside a small tombstone. He placed a single white rose on it. "Grandma," he whispered, "you were right. Kindness doesn't need wealth to exist. It just needs courage." The wind rustled through the trees, as if answering him. Daniel rose and turned toward the horizon, where the city's skyline glimmered like 1,000 eyes watching, waiting. He walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the morning mist. But somewhere deep in his pocket, the silver pendant still rested. No longer a symbol of guilt, but of redemption. Because in the end, the old woman who once asked for leftover food had left behind more than hunger. She had left behind a legacy of truth, one that would feed generations of the courage to stand, speak, and forgive. And as the dawn finally broke over the city, The light touched the wet streets like a promise that even in a world of betrayal, the smallest act of kindness could still change everything. The truth had finally been freed, and the world would never be the same again.